Mr. President.
Senator from Kentucky. Tennessee. Sorry.
Thank you. In the aftermath of the barbaric massacre committed by Iran-backed terrorist organization Hamas, there's been significant attention given to the United States Senate, to the $6 billion the Biden administration unfroze as part of a ransom deal with Iran. This is understandable. Because money is fungible, the combination of waivers and non-enforcement of sanctions has enabled Iran to spend billions of dollars bankrolling terrorists, including Hamas. This $6 billion was just the latest installment of an enormous windfall the Iranian regime has enjoyed ever since Joe Biden took office. But not enough attention has been paid to the way Congress has willingly abdicated its responsibility and allowed the executive branch to get away with a reckless policy of appeasement towards Iran. According to many recent news reports this year, the Biden administration was negotiating an unwritten agreement with Iran in which the United States would relieve billions of dollars of sanctions on Iran in return for a number of Iranian promises. One of the architects of this strategy of pursuing an informal and unwritten agreement with Iran as part of a broader strategy of appeasing the Iranians was none other than Rob Malley. Rob Malley was placed on unpaid leave by the State Department in June. He's had his security clearance suspended amid a probe into the possibility that he mishandled classified material. The results have been catastrophic. Iran has received tens of billions of dollars in revenue it would not have received had sanctions been properly enforced. Iran's continued to obstruct nuclear inspection efforts, and its proxies have continued engaging in terrorism across the region, most recently and most tragically in Israel. Furthermore, rewarding hostage-taking by paying $6 billion for the potential release of 5 American hostages, as the Biden administration recently did, as just one element of this unwritten agreement, it only incentivizes more hostage-taking of U.S. citizens abroad, both by Iran and by other adversaries. To that point, as of now, it appears that Iran-backed Hamas is holding 13 American citizens hostage in Gaza. Let me be clear. I believe the Biden administration's Iran policies are deeply misguided and threaten the security of Americans and of our partners and allies in the Middle East. But I'm not here today to debate the pros and cons of resurrecting the Iran deal or any specific agreement the Biden administration has made with Iran. The massacre in Israel last week should have settled that debate, though I suspect we'll likely continue to have that debate in the months ahead. Rather, Mr. President, I'm here today to argue for preserving the role of Congress amid concern that the Biden administration has continuously refused to enforce sanctions as part of a gradually unfolding agreement with Iran, and is doing so in such a manner that's designed to circumvent its legal obligation to submit an agreement to revive the Iran nuclear deal to Congress for review and for an up or down vote. When President Obama pursued the original Iran nuclear deal, his administration blatantly disregarded its constitutional duty to submit the agreement as a treaty, requiring the advice and the consent of 2/3 of the Senate. In response, Congress passed a law known as the Iran Nuclear Agreement Review Act, or INARA, by a vote of 99-1. In brief, the INARA law says that if the United States and Iran make any agreement related to Iran's nuclear program, the White House must submit it for congressional review and potential up or down votes in the Senate and the House of Representatives. The nearly unanimous bipartisan passage of INARA by the Senate reflected the senators' bipartisan frustration that the executive branch was ignoring the Constitution and trying to circumvent Congress on such an important matter. And yet, since taking office, the Biden administration has disregarded its legal obligations under INARA, and the U.S. Congress has allowed this administration to get away with it. If the multitude of reports are accurate, the Biden administration was intentionally avoiding calling its unfolding agreement with Iran an official agreement. That was an effort to, again, sidestep congressional approval that's required under INARA. In early 2021, I was concerned that this might happen, so I introduced the Iran Sanctions Relief Act, or ISRRA, in the 117th Congress and reintroduced it in the 118th Congress. As a backup to INARA, my bill requires congressional review and an up or down vote on any presidential waiver of Iran sanctions, whether that's labeled as an agreement or not. My bill borrows a provision from the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, or CAATSA, that overwhelmingly passed Congress back in 2017. The CAATSA provision allows for congressional review and an up or down vote on any presidential waiver of Russian sanctions. My bill takes word for word that same provision and applies it to any presidential waiver of Iran sanctions. This is important because any new agreement to revive the Iran deal will require, once again, the executive branch to waive Iran sanctions. Additionally, in light of reports that the $6 billion the Biden administration unfroze was part of the larger unwritten and informal agreement with Iran, Congress would have had the opportunity to object before the money was unfrozen had my bill had the force of law. In other words, my bill protects the role of Congress as the executive branch continues to ignore its legal obligations and refuses to submit a new agreement to the Senate and to the House. So far, 41 senators have co-sponsored the Iran Sanctions Relief Review Act. This number is significant because 41 senators would be more than enough to deny the Senate's advice and consent if the executive branch actually followed the Constitution and presented a new Iran agreement to the Senate as a treaty. The House companion to this bill has passed through the House Foreign Affairs Committee with bipartisan support. We must protect the first branch of government from an executive branch that seeks to encroach it or to ignore it. Mr. President, I yield the floor. Excuse me. Mr. President, as in a legislative session, I ask unanimous consent that the Foreign Relations Committee be discharged from further consideration of S-2210 and that the Senate proceed to its immediate consideration. I further ask that the bill be considered read a third time and passed, and that the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Is there objection?
Mr. President.
Senator from Connecticut.
Mr. President, reserving the right to object, no one is proposing lifting sanctions on Iran. This is a legislative proposal seeking to solve a problem that simply does not exist. So let's make that clear from the outset. Second, the Biden administration has been incredibly tough on Iran. Frankly, the Biden administration has drawn a lot of criticism from people like me for not re-engaging in the JCPOA. Instead, the Biden administration decided to drive a harder bargain with the Iranians. It is also not true that the Biden administration has not implemented new and additional sanctions on Iran. In fact, just a month ago, the Treasury Department announced the 13th round of new sanctions on Iran, mostly relative to the brutal suppression of the protest movement inside of that country. And so it's important to get the record straight in terms of what this administration's record has been on Iran. And it's also important for us to not create some fantasy world in which the prior administration's Iran policy was working. President Trump's Iran policy was an unmitigated disaster, an absolute disaster. Whatever you think about the JCPOA, there is just no question that after we withdrew from the JCPOA, a set of very bad things happened. One, Iran started shooting at American troops inside Iraq and inside Syria, something that was not happening during the Obama administration while we were in the JCPOA. Second, their support for proxy groups continued to increase, including to groups like Hamas. Third, they restarted their nuclear research program. They are now 1 month away from a nuclear weapon. And fourth, the coalition that had been assembled to organize efforts to contain and to isolate Iran fell apart. And so let's not put a gloss on what was a disastrous Iran policy under the previous regime. But as to the senator's proposal, even if we have disagreements on the JCPOA or on Iran policy, this proposed legislation is just really bad policy. It's really bad policy, and it will make American sanctions much weaker and much less effective. Why is that? What this proposal suggests is that for Iran sanctions, every time you lift or waive a sanction, you have to come to Congress. Now, we have sanctions levied against, I would guess, thousands of Iranian institutions, organizations, and individuals. And the purpose of sanctions is to change behavior, right? It's not just punishment. Sanctions are about delivering a consequence to an individual, an organization, or a country for their bad behavior as a means of trying to get them to change that behavior. And once they change that behavior, the sanction is lifted. That's why Congress traditionally does not require a separate congressional review process, a separate congressional vote every time an administration lifts a sanction, because you need for an administration to be nimble in applying sanctions and also lifting sanctions. Because if a foreign individual in Iran or any other place understands that in order for a sanction to be lifted, not only does the administration have to lift it, but Congress has to have a debate and a vote, it is no incentive to change behavior. So I just think this is really bad policy. Whether or not you like President Biden's Iran policy, and I do, whether or not you supported the JCPOA, tying the administration's hands on sanction policy in this way just makes the sanctions much less effective. I get it that Republicans don't like Joe Biden, and they don't like Joe Biden's foreign policy. But this would be bad under a Republican president as well. I am very glad to work with my colleague on increasing the role that Congress plays on broad foreign policy decisions. But I think that there are some day-to-day administrations of foreign policy, like the decision as to when to waive or lift a particular individual sanction, that would become far too burdensome and contrary to national security interests if Congress got involved to the degree that this legislation suggests. And so for that reason, simply because I think this is bad policy, whether this was about Iran policy or Venezuela policy or Russia policy, I just think it makes our sanctions policy much harder to effectuate and ultimately makes our sanctions regimes weaker, not stronger. For those reasons, I would object.
Mr. President.
Objection is heard. Senator from Tennessee.
Mr. President, I would welcome the opportunity to work with my colleague, Senator Murphy, on sanctions policies that make sense. But I would say this: if this policy is good enough for Qatar and Russia, why wouldn't it be good enough for Iran? The Senate has already passed Qatar. I've used the exact language. I'd also like to say this: if it's true that this administration is not waiving sanctions and is not entering an agreement, they should have no difficulty with this level of review. I don't believe that's the case. And I'd also like to address the accusations, I should say, leveled against the policy in the last administration after the withdrawal of the JCPOA. Iran never stopped their nuclear program. Israel, through a very brave and courageous raid, proved that. They were continuing on that path. As part of my prior job as U.S. Ambassador to Japan, it was my responsibility to get Japan to stop buying Iranian crude. I was successful at that after many rounds of negotiation. We cut Iran's fund flows down to a trickle. That starved Iran's ability to fund its proxies like Hamas and Hezbollah. In fact, it was widely reported in the media that Hamas and Hezbollah were going broke. That all changed when the policy of appeasement came back in 2021. By avoiding sanctions, by not enforcing sanctions, the estimates are as high as $80 billion of fresh oil, illicit oil revenues that have entered Iran's coffers. We know about the payment that was allowed by Iraq to Iran by this administration. Senator Cotton just addressed this. And the $6 billion that's received so much scrutiny in the media just recently. All of this has enriched Iran. All of this has put Iran in a better position to fund its proxies and fuel them. And I think all of this is part of a very misguided policy of appeasement. I yield the floor.